Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. Mercy of the God of War. Episode 19. The fifth prince had just jumped out of the window too, but Cassandra was several meters ahead of him and had no intention of slowing down. The only thing that interested her right now was the lake, but something caught her attention as she was rushing towards it. On the ground were several shadows of lines crossing over each other. She raised her head to find where they were coming from. A grid. That crazy second prince had laid out a grid of thick, long, silver chains running between the roofs, covering the open area. Was it meant to keep the dragons from entering there? She didn't remember seeing anything like this during her flight earlier with Orpheus, but then again it would have been impossible for him to cover the whole imperial palace. Had he just laid these in the areas where he had hidden the emperor? This was insane. It also explained Glahad's absence. Where had the golden dragon gone if he wasn't by his master's side? Had he been trapped in some way? Cassandra didn't have time to wonder any more, as she heard the crack of the whip dangerously close behind her. She accelerated despite the pain in her back and legs. The strain from all the running and climbing was starting to take its toll on her body, but she ignored it, only focusing on the lake, and running faster than the two princes. "What are you doing?" She ignored them. Her feet were already in the water as she tried to scrutinize the surface of the lake. She walked in, but she couldn't see much. With the sunlight reflecting on the surface, it was too deep and too dark to see anything past a couple of meters beneath the surface. How deep was the lake? While singing her song those weeks ago, she had stayed where she could just sit with the water at her waist. Now, she had to go as far as she could. The familiar feeling of water enveloping her legs gave her some more strength, and she tore the edges of her dress so she could walk and then swim more comfortably. The whip cracked again, just breaking the surface of the water next to her. He had just barely missed, but he was close enough to hit her. "Don't kill her," shouted Vrihan. "We need her alive." Ironically, the second prince may have saved her life. Lephis kept trying to get a hold of her, but the prince apparently wasn't good at gauging his own strength. Either he was too heavy with it and violently slashed the water, or too light and he missed her completely. Cassandra kept going, half swimming now. She knew the dragon princes wouldn't follow her into the water, but everything was going to depend on how long she could stay beneath the surface. She took several deep breaths, and when her lungs felt full, she finally dove in. As she hurried deeper in the lake, she heard the echo of the whip breaking the surface above her. Cassandra needed to get far enough away so they couldn't reach her. She had no idea where she was going. It took her eyes a long minute to adjust to the water before she was finally able to see clearly. As she had suspected, it was indeed significantly deeper than it looked from the surface. She couldn't tell how much exactly, but she kept going deeper. As she dove, Cassandra couldn't help but silently pray the air she had stored would last as long as she needed. As she swam past various fish, she thought how eerie it was, being submerged in this underwater world with everything going on above. It was likely no one from the imperial family had ever bothered to try swimming in the lake, as none of the fish looked bothered by her presence, like she posed no real threat. Cassandra kept going deeper. Her composition was different from the Dragon Empire's people. Her legs could paddle for a long time without becoming too tired, and her eyes weren't troubled by the water. Her body could handle the pressure, and her lungs could retain air for a long time. Hence, she continued past what any other person around could withstand. What had the emperor hoped she would find in that lake? Was this even the right lake he had mentioned? It was too late to wonder and worry about it now. As she got farther away from the surface, she was soon surrounded by darkness. As she soon realized, the light wasn't the only thing that was slowly disappearing. There were less and less fish too. Why? She would have thought all those underwater creatures would enjoy the calmness in the lower levels of the lake, but instead, all the little fish stayed closer to the surface, as if they were too scared to go further, and the few that dared venture lower didn't stay long, quickly turning around. Cassandra hesitated. Should she still go down after witnessing that? What were the depths of the lake hiding? She glanced upwards. It felt strangely calm down here compared to what was waiting for her on the surface, though she had no choice anyway. The danger was surely much more grave up there. The young concubine kept going down, her eyes now struggling to see anything. She had a strange feeling. As if something was looking at her, lurking in the darkness. Something dangerous. Cassandra was starting to feel a little unwell. The air in her lungs was slowly running out, and she was becoming tired. Her body was resenting all the vigorous exercise from the day, and the water pressure was compounding her discomfort. She couldn't give up yet. She had to spend as much time as she could searching underwater, and, even if she couldn't find anything down there, she needed to delay her return to the surface as long as possible. Suddenly, something quickly swam past her. She froze. It was big. Very big. It had what seemed like a long body, something much longer than any underwater creature she had ever heard of. A giant snake, maybe? Fear was starting to claw at the back of her mind, and not being able to see anything was making it even more terrifying. If a beast did decide to attack her, she was completely defenseless. She had left Orpheus' earring in his brother's neck to delay his healing process, and she had given her dagger to Missandra before they left for the palace. As her younger sister was a better fighter, she was the better choice to hold the weapon, in case they found themselves in such a situation, but she hadn't even thought of taking it back when they parted ways. Though she probably wouldn't have anyway, she was now regretting that. She had nothing to defend herself with. The creature moved next to her again, and a loud sound resonated like an echo in the water. Cassandra's eyes grew larger. Was that a growl? It was higher pitched than a dragon's, but it was still so similar to Cray's. It couldn't be, could it? Suddenly, the strange growl echoed out again as she turned towards its origin, squinting her eyes to try and locate the creature's exact position. If it could see her, why hadn't it attacked yet? Was that thing what the fish were afraid of? Cassandra focused on the water's movements around her, trying to figure out where the creature would swim to next. It ought to be massive judging by the growl it made. A crazy theory was growing in the back of her mind, but it seemed absolutely impossible. Two big white lights suddenly appeared in the darkness. Cassandra had to cover her mouth so as not to scream and lose more of her precious air. The lights were big, like diamonds, and they were eyes. A pair of reptilian eyes. The two eyes grew closer, and Cassandra tried to swim away by reflex. Judging from the size of them, whatever creature they belonged to had to be enormous. If that thing decided it wanted to hunt her, she was already dead. However, the eyes didn't appear menacing. In fact, as they slowly grew closer, there was no animosity in them at all. Cassandra froze, though her heart was beating like crazy. What was that thing? She decided to stop and let it approach. She couldn't go far or fast enough to flee it anyway. If she was going to die, better make it quick. A giant snout gradually appeared below the white eyes. It was covered in scales and Cassandra thought they might be dark gray, but they really could have been any color. In this darkness, she couldn't tell. A large snout protruded out and sniffed her, the creature's head slowly coming into view as it continued approaching her. Cassandra was speechless. It was impossible, but she couldn't make this up, it was definitely a dragon's head. The head was a bit leaner than any dragon she had seen, and there were no little horns on the side of its face or on its head, only two long ones, cascading back down from the top of its head, though one of them was broken. The cheeks were a bit rounder too, and Cassandra noticed the wide and long holes along the neck as the creature turned its head slightly. Could those be gills? The creature circled around her, clearly assessing her. Cassandra wondered if she could even call it a dragon, but regardless, she was fascinated by the creature. The face was clearly that of a dragon, but its body was different from those she knew. It was leaner, with shorter limbs and, more importantly, the joints of those limbs had large fans. The creature was slithering its body slowly and meticulously to move itself. Cassandra was amazed. From what she observed of them, those had to be like fins. There were several on its back too, and the tail of the dragon had a similar shape, as well. This seemed so impossible, she wondered if she hadn't lost consciousness already and was perhaps hallucinating it all. But, the creature next to her was very real. It kept swimming in circles around her, never taking its eyes off her, and growled again. Cassandra wondered if this was it. If she was going to be killed by such an unbelievable creature. Was this what the king wanted her to find? Cassandra didn't have much air left in her lungs. She was slowly suffocating and her head was starting to spin a bit. She glanced towards the surface. What should she do? It was already a miracle that this dragon-like being hadn't attacked her by now. Such a magnificent creature. Cassandra had no more oxygen left. She opened her mouth slightly, feeling too tired to fight anymore. The creature slowly swam closer to her, and she somehow managed some strength to extend her arm. The dragon, if it even was one, slid past her, letting her fingers slide across its skin. It was incredibly cold. Contrary to Cray's warmth. Cassandra chuckled, her brain finding that information funny. She couldn't hold on anymore. She wanted to close her eyes. One last growl resonated through the waters before she lost consciousness. As if Cashin had understood his father, the little baby had a very serious frown on and was holding on to the little plushie's tail fiercely. Despite the overall situation, Karen's heart warmed up a little at that sight. The child was indeed his son, brave and strong, like his parents. He held him for a while as if trying to learn all of his son's features by heart. Karen had never been interested in children, but Cashin was different. He was truly a part of both of his parents. Karen remembered how impatient Cassandra had been to finally see their son and hold him. She only had 1 week with her baby, while Karen had lost the entire first week of his newborn's life. Fate truly was too horrible sometimes. He hugged his baby gently. He had never been trained to carry a baby, but somehow, all the right movements came to him naturally, as if his instincts were guiding him. Cashin didn't seem upset being carried in his father's strong and sturdy arms. The baby was actually engrossed with his plushie, though he was barely able to hold on to it. With his little mouth forming O's, he looked like he was sizing up the plushie. His expression was quite amusing. Karen couldn't help but recognize some of Cassandra's features there, his little nose, the shape of his eyes. Even his irises had hints of green in them, and his skin was just a shade lighter than his father's, but not nearly as light as his mother's. Oh, by the gods! Lady Karine had just arrived behind him and was staring at the baby, her eyes filled with emotions. The imperial concubine's heart melted at the sight of the newborn in Karen's arms. She seemed at a loss for words, and just gently caressed the baby's hands for a few seconds. From Karen's arms, the baby squealed in excitement upon seeing a new face. She kept smiling gently at him, but Karen's mind was elsewhere. "Mother, take him." He carefully passed Cashin to his mother, gave him a little kiss on his head in doing so, and then took out his weapon. It was unfortunate that things were so dire already, as they had very little time for a meaningful reunion. Sherian was guarding the door for now, but Vrihan's men knew where they were. Karen could hear them outside, banging against every door. It would only be a matter of minutes before they barged in, unless his sister lost patience and went to them first. Kyun! Karen almost jumped at the little squeal and looked down. Against his leg, a small, silver-scaled dragon was rubbing its back against him and looking up with big green eyes. The war god smiled once again and leaned down to pick the little dragon up. Kian immediately jumped onto his shoulder, which was broad enough for him to perch on comfortably. "Oh, by the great dragon, he is perfect," exclaimed Lady Karine on the verge of tears. Though she wasn't wrong, the new grandmother was already blinded by love. With her knowledge of dragons, she could clearly see Kian was a bit different from all the other dragons she had ever encountered before. He had a longer and leaner body, and his wings were thinner and shorter, too. It was most likely that unless they grew bigger sometime soon, he probably wouldn't be able to manage long flights or heavy weights, like Cray could. Karen didn't have time for this, however. Keeping the young dragon on his shoulder, he turned towards the women from before. They might have both been scared of the war god, but at least they did not run away. They were already aware of his tender relationship with Cassandra and Cashin, but he was still an impressive man to see in the flesh. "Where is Cassandra?" he asked. Lady Cassandra went to the imperial palace," explained one of the women, who was actually Yazora. "She wanted to find and heal the emperor." "She went alone," protested Karine. "She went with young lady Miss Andra," added Yazora. "They wanted to find one of the herbal gardens or medicines there, as we didn't have time to procure any here." "She's not wrong," sighed Karine. "That rat, Vrihan, must have had all the capital's apothecaries watched the second he knew Cassie was back. And then? We don't know, Your Highness. The girls left hours ago, and we haven't heard any news since." "Hours ago," exclaimed Karine, shocked. She turned to Karen, livid. Hours ago could mean bad or good news at this point. At least they hadn't found their bodies strung up on the palace's walls. But in a few hours, they could very well have been caught, tortured, or killed. There might still be a chance the girls were alive, but there was no leaning towards one option over the other. "Let's go," said Karen, determined. Karine nodded and followed him, still carrying Cashin. There was no way the war god was going to part with his son for a single minute, and the imperial concubine could very well protect him herself. They left the room and found Sherian and Anur in the garden, both of them watching the gate, which was still holding against their assailants, though it was obviously having quite a bad day. "Oh, here's my nephew," said Sherian with a smirk, staring at the baby. "Wow, you're lucky he took after his mom. Even for a baby, he's cute." "That dragon is amazing," added Anur, his eyes on little Kian. "His tail is so long. He's even leaner than Rune." Actually, all three dragons present were quite intrigued by the baby dragon. Kian jumped down from Karen's shoulder and ran to Kray. Though the black dragon looked a bit surprised, it carefully walked closer, the big red eyes wide open with curiosity. To the side, Rune wasn't as patient. The green dragon growled, almost jumping on the baby dragon, but Kray reacted immediately, growling louder as a warning. The green dragon retreated with its head low. Between them, Kian seemed to have not even noticed Rune. The baby dragon kept running up to Kray, all excited. The black dragon clearly didn't know how to react, especially as the baby dragon easily disappeared under its big body. Kray kept trying to look down and around, but the excited Kian kept scuttling over and under, jumping on its paws playfully, making cute squeaks, and chasing Kray's big black tail. Finally, the big black dragon growled and, when Kian made another move close enough, caught the baby dragon under its paw. Surprised, Kian squealed a bit, but Kray tilted its head, and carefully grabbed the baby in its mouth. The baby dragon swung its little paws, unhappy with this new position, but Kray ignored it as it walked up to Karen. The dragon looked like a cat with its pissed-off kitten, making everyone smile. "Don't you hurt him, Kray," warned Karine with a frown. It was unlikely Kray would harm the baby dragon voluntarily, but keeping the baby in its mouth without biting with those sharp fangs must have been quite difficult for Kray, especially as Kian was particularly unruly. However, the black dragon looked like it was controlling the situation, and its offspring, perfectly. They didn't have much time to keep observing these intimate interactions though. The shouts were getting louder behind the door. Karen cracked his neck, and his sister looked even more impatient. All the servants had run back inside the mansion to hide. A small army was surely waiting for them out there, but these people had dragon's blood and actual dragons with them. "This is going to take all day." The princess took a deep breath, taking in as much air as she could into her lungs and, after a couple of seconds, she exhaled a massive fireball towards the door, sending it and everyone behind it flying. The imperial princess smirked. "Now we can actually get to it." With a demonic smile on her face, she ran into the crowd of soldiers who were still standing or trying to get back up on their feet. Karen glanced back towards him, but Cashin was perfectly safe in his grandmother's arms. She had even shielded him from the smoke by raising her sleeve, though the baby only seemed to care about his plushie. The imperial prince ran to support his sister. Sherian didn't need much help though, but the faster they dealt with these soldiers, the faster they'd get to the imperial palace and to Cassandra. There wasn't a single second to lose. Behind them, Rune and Cray began jumping to attack the soldiers, too. When Kian started growling at them angrily, Cray finally let go and, though it was too small to attack, the baby dragon jumped from its head to its back, sending growls left and right as if it was the one fighting. The imperial siblings fought their way to the imperial palace. It was a long fight to get there as they couldn't use the dragons with the roofs being trapped. The residence was quite far from the imperial palace, and it seemed like the number of men sent by Vrihan was endless. More importantly, they soon realized the imperial army was already there. The colors of the soldiers were codified, and Sherian and Karen didn't even need to talk to each other to know who they were fighting against. They just exchanged glances, and kept going. Fighting the imperial army was not easy inside the capital, especially not with two dragons by their side. It was the same as the fight against the Eastern Republic's army. They had to be cautious of the locals, so the dragons couldn't even use their fire. However, Karen, Sherian, and the two dragons alone were enough to fight their way through the whole imperial army, no matter how much slower the progress. The soldiers were obviously afraid of them, though they were trained not to retreat. Karen and Sherian fought one man after another, slaughtering everyone in their way without stopping. It was a dance of death. Blood flying through the air and violence dispersing terrified citizens that dared to venture outside at the wrong time. The siblings and the dragons only occupied a couple of streets, but they were a horror scene. They had no mercy and no time to care about doing a clean job of this. Your Highness! Karen turned to the left, taking his sword out of a man's chest, soon realizing they weren't alone anymore. Many soldiers of a different outfit were now standing or running in the same direction as them, opposing the imperial army. One of the generals ran to Karen's side, bowing with a military salute. "Your East Army," exclaimed Sherian, surprised. "Already? We came as soon as we got Lady Karen's message, Your Highness. We couldn't stay put, especially with Your Highness and Lady Cassandra in danger." Indeed, they soon heard the sounds of the two armies fighting resonating from all the nearby streets. The fight had now been taken much farther into the capital's streets. Screams and sounds of weapons striking filled the air. It was a war scene everywhere the eye could see. Karen and Sherian exchanged a smile in spite of their tiredness and the sweat and blood soaking their armor. With the East Army here, they could finally cut through the smaller fights and make it to the Imperial Palace quicker. The fighting resumed, more violent than before. Throughout the city, hundreds of men fought to get to the Imperial Palace or keep others from it. The fighting going into the night, long past sunset. When the sun had touched the ground, they finally presented themselves at the palace's doors. The fight wasn't over, but the siblings had finally reached their destination. Both Sherian and Karen were a bit tired after all of that, but neither of them wanted to stop. They sent people to get Phaedra, their hostage, and cleared the area around them, making sure no one would try to stop them from entering. In the streets, the East Army was clearly winning, establishing a clear perimeter around the palace. Unlike the East Army, none of the Imperial Army had been trained in first aid, and they had to watch as Karen's men helped their own people, while theirs suffered. What was happening in the streets was no longer Karen's concern. He was glaring at the doors, impatient to finally wrap his hands around Vrihan's neck. He glanced at his sister, who nodded. Just like before, Sherian took a deep breath, and used her fire on the large doors. It was the most efficient way and, after that, both siblings only had to use a bit of strength on the doors for them to finally collapse. Leaving the armies to fight each other outside, they walked in. Kareen followed a few steps behind with Evan and Anur as bodyguards, even though she probably didn't need them. "Where to, mother?" asked Karen, unsure. "I don't know. Let's just head for the rats' apartments first." As they walked through the corridors, everything felt quiet. Strangely quiet. They'd had to leave the dragons outside, as both Rune and Kray were too big to squeeze through the front doors, but it was still too quiet. Dragons or not, they didn't spot a single servant for a long while. The Imperial Palace had certainly changed a lot since their last visit here, and none of them were particularly fond of this new atmosphere. "Brother!" Karen followed her glare. They were still on their way, but something strange was happening to the side. Several Imperial soldiers were guarding the lake, their weapons in hand. The siblings exchanged a glance. Men guarding the lake? They decided to ignore it and, instead, continued rushing inside when a loud sound resonated. A long, long blow. Kareen froze. "The Emperor," she whispered. They all knew that sound. It was only used in the event of an imperial death. Their blood froze in their veins, and without thinking, Sherian and Karen started running towards the Emperor's hall. When they barged in, they were welcomed with 100 soldiers pointing their weapons at them. The hall was filled with Imperial soldiers and at the very end, facing them, Vrihan sat on the golden throne, his dragon sitting behind him. Both of the red beast's eyes were completely destroyed, they were just two big black holes now. It was obviously blind. However, the dragon wasn't their main worry at the moment and neither were the soldiers. In front of them, Vrihan was holding Missandra by her hair, a knife threateningly held against her throat. A strange silence followed their arrival into the room. Karen and Vrihan were fiercely glaring at each other from across the dozens of soldiers between them. Even if they had been alone, the atmosphere wouldn't have gotten an inch colder. The poor men stuck between the two imperial princes even felt a bit out of place, exchanging worried glances at each other. After all, none of them had signed up to be standing up against the Empire's war god himself. Those men were Imperial guards, trained to obey the Emperor only, and they would do so until their death, but this situation just didn't feel right for any of them. Princess Sherian, who was known for her own military merits, was glaring at them like she was looking at a crowd of vermin. She couldn't believe the nerve of them to side with Vrihan. The Imperial princess had a sour expression on her face. She had abandoned her swords to steal a spear from one of the Imperial generals she had defeated. That weapon was heavy and meant for a man, but she had no problem carrying it nonchalantly on her shoulders. Her stare went to Missandra with a sigh. So things had turned that bad here. Anur, too, was staring at Missandra non-stop, unable to say a word, only feeling scared for her. "You're a bit late, brother," said Vrihan, speaking first. "You missed my coronation." Karen didn't bother to answer, but Sherian stood forward, furious. What coronation? You're no more worthy of the title of emperor than you are worthy of putting you on that throne, Vrihan. Her words angered him, and he suddenly pulled more on Miss Sandra's hair, making her groan in pain. She was keeping herself from crying, but the young woman was teary-eyed, as he was keeping her neck bent in a weird position, and the blade was held against her skin. Sherian clenched her teeth, annoyed. If he had captured Miss Andra, it didn't mean anything good for her sister either. Anur almost stepped forward, but Sherian quickly held his arm and pushed him back towards her mother. What happened to the old man? Suddenly asked Karine. For the first time, her voice was cold as ice, but she was strangely calm and composed. The second prince answered with an annoyed expression. He is dead. I am the emperor now. You're no longer the favorite. This was such a weak insult, it wouldn't make the proud imperial concubine flinch. Karine's glare was much fiercer, and it looked like nothing could make her waver, not even the news of her past lover's death. Either she didn't believe it, she hid her emotions perfectly, or she wasn't affected, one couldn't tell. She was just standing there, an empty look in her eyes. From glaring at the concubine, Vrihan's eyes went down to the baby she was holding. His black eyes opened wider, in a horrified, disgusted expression as he discovered Kashan. Karen moved right away to stand between Vrihan's line of sight and his son, glaring right back at him. That little bastard, hissed Vrihan. Kian, who had followed them, jumped on Karen's shoulder at that moment, and growled at him, arching its back. Where is Cassandra? Asked Karen, impatient. This time, the second prince's face broke into a nasty smile, looking quite happy. He chuckled, but it soon turned into a crazy laugh. His voice echoed along the walls, making everyone but him rather uneasy. You crazy, hissed Sherian. She's dead, yelled the second prince. Karen didn't move, but his fingers tightened around his weapon. She is dead, she killed herself to escape me. You're lying, muttered Sherian. She couldn't help but send worried glances at Karen. If Cassandra was really dead, her brother was really going to lose it. Facing them, Vrihan kept laughing like crazy, amused by the war god's furious expression. You were a war god, Karen, but now you're so affected by her's death? Well, your woman is dead. She dove into the lake, and she never came back. It's Cassandra, Karen, whispered Karine behind him. She can stay underwater for a long time. Oh, you think she could still be alive? I will break it to you, she is not coming back. Your women dove into that lake hours ago. Even that witch can't survive hours under the surface. It's a pity. I would have loved to show you her dead body, just for the pleasure of seeing your face. Whatever he had hoped to see, Karen wasn't going to give him that pleasure. Whether he believed it or not, and despite his sister's worried glances, all of his rage was contained inside. However, they did hear the furious growls of a dragon coming from the outside. Unlike Karen, Kray was going rogue outside the palace's walls. Yet here, its master was only clenching his jaw in his fists and glaring like a tiger at Vrihan. He slowly raised his sword. You're going to die, he whispered. That simple sentence erased all smiles from Vrihan's lips. The second prince stood up, and directed their attention towards Miss Andra. His blade against her throat was tracing a thin red line on her skin. Sherian clicked her tongue. "Oh, no, I don't think so. You are going to throw your weapons, or I'll slice this woman like a pig in front of you. Both of you," he added, glaring at Sherian as well. "You. And what happens if we refuse? You only have one hostage. Once she's dead we would have no problem killing you." "Oh, I don't need to kill her straight away," chuckled Vrihan. "I can slice her pretty skin, little by little, until you obey. Her skin is way too neat, compared to her older sisters, isn't it? I could even chop off a few limbs." "We have Fitra," declared Sherian. "How about we do the same thing to your precious younger sister?" Vrihan laughed loudly again, his horrible laugh making Sherian roll her eyes. "Do you think I care about my sister? She was only useful for some time. Princesses aren't as watched as the princes, you see. She was very helpful in making more allies within the Senate." "I knew she opened her legs," hissed Sherian. "You two are such fool," continued Vrihan. "All you can do is fight, you are not fit to be the emperor." "Oh, right, we are not some vile scheming rat like you." Just as she said that, Vrihan got even madder, and his dragon growled furiously, too, taking one step forward. They couldn't have missed his eyes, both completely covered in a dry dark liquid that ought to be blood. "Your dragon doesn't look in top shape, Vrihan," snickered Sherian. That sentence didn't help make him any calmer, and without warning, he suddenly raised his weapon and carved a long, deep line down Miss Sandra's arm. The young woman screamed in pain, closing her eyes and crying out. "Keep making me mad, Sherian. I still have plenty of surfaces to keep going on her body." That's when Karen recognized the weapon Vrihan was holding. It was Cassandra's dagger, the one that formerly belonged to Fitra. This time, the war god saw red and stepped forward. However, Vrihan was quick to react and put his knife back against Miss Sandra's throat. No, Karen. If you take another step, I swear I'll butcher her." The third prince stood there for a second, his eyes on the young girl. Miss Andra was crying in pain, her blood dripping from her injury. That bastard had cut her deep on purpose, to make her injury more painful and impressive. He didn't want to give him any victory, but she was still Cassandra's younger sister. He glanced at the blind dragon and snickered. He threw his weapons. The two swords resonated on the marble floor, and even the soldiers in front of him looked confused. The war god was giving up on his weapons, to save a woman? Behind him, Sherian was just as annoyed, but after hesitating, she was about to throw her spear when Miss Andra spoke. "Don't. Please don't care about me. I'd rather die than let this survive." Miss Andra, called out Anur, horrified, a second too late. "Shut up, little vermin. Or I shall cut you some more." Vrihan put his threat to execution right away, stabbing Miss Sandra's shoulder. She screamed again, and fell down on her knees, in a horrible state of pain. Her voice resonated throughout the palace's walls, making even the soldiers uncomfortable. This situation was really not one they wanted to be in. Meanwhile, Sherian's hands were almost turning white from holding her spear so tightly. In her head, she was already going over the scenarios of what she'd do to that once he was dead. Next to her, Anur was the most horrified. The young boy looked like he was about to faint, his eyes on Miss Andra, completely shocked. He couldn't do anything but watch the horrible display of violence against her. "Vrihan, enough!" yelled Karine. "Sherian still has her weapon," he retorted, staring at his half-sister. "Don't!" To everyone's surprise, despite her tears, Miss Andra still looked fierce and determined. Down on her knees, holding her bleeding shoulder, her lips trembling, she was still able to look at Sherian from across the hall. The girl ought to be in an excruciating state of pain, but she still acted as if she wasn't. "Didonti," she begged. "Don't let that bastard win." "Shut up, I said," he yelled. Vrihan kicked her injury and pressed his shoe on it, forcing Miss Andra to bow lower and lower, in a horrible position. His shoe sole was soon completely red, but the girl did not avert her eyes from the little group across the room. Never had she looked so much like her older sister. "That bastard murdered my sister and raped his own sister." "Shut up!" "He did what?" This time, even Karine looked utterly shocked and baffled. "You rotten rat! What did you do?" muttered Sherian. "I said shut up!" "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up!" yelled Vrihan, absolutely furious. He kicked Miss Andra relentlessly until the girl was completely lying underneath him, half-conscious. A heavy silence followed that horrible scene. Even if he hadn't said a thing, Vrihan's anger at the girl's words made the truth obvious. Everyone in that hall could understand that. Suddenly, Kian squealed, and jumped down Karen's arm, running in the opposite direction, leaving the room. "Kian, no! Lady Karine!" The baby dragon disappeared into the corridors, while Lady Karine ran after it, still holding Kashan. Evan immediately ran after her, too. He didn't have his place in a fight against so many soldiers anyway, and the imperial servant was concerned about Cassandra's baby. Anur glanced at them leaving, hesitant. "Go with them," said Karen, his eyes still glaring in Vrihan's way. His younger brother hesitated. He wasn't comfortable letting their mother and the babies run away, but war god or not, Karen was in an unfavorable position there. Moreover, he had already thrown his weapon, and Anur knew he and Sherian wouldn't risk Miss Andra getting killed either. Vrihan was a poor fighter, but he still had his dragon. Yet, he had trouble leaving. When Miss Andra was like that. "Are you sure?" he whispered. Karen didn't answer, which was the equivalent of a definite answer from him. Sherian gave him a nod, too. Anur swallowed his saliva, a bit bitter to have to leave them. However, he wasn't stupid. He wasn't on his older siblings' level, he would have been no more than a hindrance here. After one last glare towards Vrihan, trying not to look at the injured Miss Andra, Anur finally ran out, to catch up to Lady Karine. Once he was gone, the war god and his sister were suddenly left alone with an army of imperial soldiers, Vrihan and his dragon. Sherian sighed. "About 200 men? Really, Vrihan, you're such a coward. Drop your weapon, Sherian, and recognize me as the emperor," hissed the second prince. "Or I swear I'll finish this girl and you'll have to watch her bleed out." Sherian glanced down at Miss Andra. The young girl was still not moving, one couldn't tell if she was still breathing. Only her eyes were still teary, turned towards them. After a few seconds of staring at each other, she very distinctly saw Miss Andra nod. Sherian sighed. "You're not too rusty yet, brother," she said, her eyes on Vrihan, making her spear turn between her hands. "Stop playing!" she snickered. Suddenly, her eyes went up on the red dragon. "Enough!" yelled Vrihan, feeling what was going to happen. "I am the new emperor. The council already agreed. You can't kill me, I am the emperor." Sherian laughed. "Oh, Vrihan, you're really the emperor of rats. The council, you said? You convinced a bunch like you to sign some paperwork, and just like that, you think we should leave you father's throne? Don't worry about the council. I think it will be time for some serious spring cleaning once we are done with you." Vrihan's eyes opened wide, and he stepped back. Sherian was still smiling like a cat about to eat a bird. "You know what? I think we need fresh blood on the council seat. How about we start with yours?" Just like that, she suddenly threw her spear across the room. Her weapon flew far above the head of the soldiers and, with a horrible sound, dug deep in the red dragon's shoulder. The gigantic beast growled furiously in pain and anger and jumped to attack, coming their way. The first ranks of soldiers, distracted by the dragon, turned their heads back a second too late. They met Karen's furious glare from extremely up close, and a second later, the war god's fist began wreaking havoc around him. Cassandra slowly woke up to the sound of something dripping next to her. She suddenly felt a horrible sensation in her throat and started coughing out some water, almost suffocating as she was trying to get some air back. She felt exhausted, and a bit dizzy, though she was lying down. Underneath her was something cold, and wet. It wasn't very comfortable either. She struggled to move her body, pushing on her numb arms to help herself sit up. Her hands met with the cold rocky ground. Cassandra coughed a little, spitting some water again. She felt exhausted, but her instincts quickly reminded her of the dangerous situation. She sat up, looking around anxiously. She had no idea where she was, but somehow, the presence of light disturbed her. Her memories were slowly coming back, and she was almost sure she had lost consciousness in the deep, dark waters of the lake in the imperial palace. So the question was, where was she now? Against all expectations, she was alive, but with no idea where she had ended up. As her eyes got used to the blinding light coming from above, Cassandra slowly realized she was surrounded by rock walls. In all shades of grey, sometimes silverish, the undefined walls of this cave were making a semi-sphere above her head. She could still hear water clearly dripping all around her. How far was she under the surface level? If there was this much light, she couldn't be too deep. She barely had any strength left and wished to remain seated, but somehow, she couldn't just stay still either. How had she even gotten here? A few meters away from her, there was what looked like a large pond, or a little lake. It was completely still and quiet, and everything else was echoing inside the cave. She could almost hear her own heartbeat echoing. Cassandra realized her body was cold, but not as wet as someone who had just gotten out of the water. How long had she been here? She was completely at a loss and even more panicked due to that. What happened to Orpheus and Miss Andra? What about the old emperor? Her head was aching a little bit. She touched her forehead and felt a vivid pain. It was a bit swollen. So she had bumped her head in something, causing the headache. Cassandra sighed. What had she gotten herself into this time? She looked around, trying to look for the creature from before, just in case, but she was obviously completely alone. After much effort, she finally got back on her feet. She was in a poor state. Her legs and arms were covered in bruises as if she had been dragged around on that same rocky ground. Cassandra looked at the water again. Had she been taken out of there, and how? By whom? She was obviously alone here. She tried to walk to the walls, checking if there wasn't some opening she may have missed. It was all stones, ground, ceiling, and walls alike, thousands of little stones, and she couldn't see all of the different levels of the wall. It was sharp too, but some had iridescent reflections, like pink or blue. They almost looked like dark gemstones. Cassandra's eyes were attracted to the light above again. What she had taken for a bright light was actually some long slit in the ceiling, letting in what was most likely natural light. Cassandra squinted her eyes, trying to see anything. She was almost sure she had seen some movement up there. Was she actually that close to the ground surface? Suddenly, something moved in the water. She retreated towards the wall as a reflex, but there was nowhere to run. Slowly, scales started appearing at the surface. Cassandra felt her blood go cold again. She could see parts of the body undulate in the water and surface at some places like a snake swimming around. How big was it really? She had been unable to see the whole body in the water, but now, she could see it move in so many places. She was only starting to get the reality of this creature's real size. Then, the head slowly merged out of the water. First, the two horns she had seen, one of them broken at half its length. Then, the silver eyes appeared. They were so clear. If it wasn't clearly staring at her, Cassandra would have wondered if it wasn't actually blind. Then, the nose and maw came out of the water, dripping. She tried to keep breathing normally, but no matter how she looked at it, this creature was part dragon. A very, very large and strange dragon. With an elongated head and neck, there was plenty of space for the many gills moving with each breath the creature took. Cassandra didn't even know if she should have been surprised, scared, or amazed, but she was all of that at the same time. The dragon let out a long, high-pitched growl that echoed along the cave's walls, and more of its body came out. The front limbs weren't anything like what she had seen before. She had thought they were short, but unlike the dragon's short paws, those were longer and more retractable. They were obviously halfway between arms and fins. Even the fingers of the creature had curved claws and were tied together with webbing. It didn't actually use its limbs to move around, his body was crawling almost like a snake. Cassandra retreated further, not even daring to blink for 1 second. She felt like her own breathing was way too loud. The creature didn't lose her for a second. It was completely focused on her as it was coming out of the water, more and more of its body crawling out. Cassandra had wrongly judged its size. If she had to compare it with the dragons she had seen before, its head was about as big as Glahad's, but there was no real comparison in terms of its body. It would have been like comparing a cat to a snake. While its neck was very thick, the rest of its body didn't grow in size at all. It was all the same width, but very, very long. It felt like the end was never coming, and the body almost had to spiral onto itself to find enough space, as Cassandra kept retreating further and further away. She was grateful the cave was so vast, because there were few rooms inside the imperial palace that could have welcomed this creature comfortably. How old was this creature to have gotten so big? Its body was meters and meters long. When she finally spotted the little legs, she realized those were in no way meant to walk either, but just to stabilize the end of the body. They were thinner and shorter than the front paws. Finally, the tail came out, almost ridiculously little and simple compared to the rest of that majestic creature. Cassandra was at a loss for words as they were just staring at each other. This thing was not a dragon as the Dragon Empire knew them. It was something similar, maybe a related species. Cassandra exhaled, realizing she had been holding her breath for a while now. Thank the gods, this creature wasn't menacing at all. It only stared, and had only growled once, if it was a growl. Cassandra had seen much scarier dragons, so she wasn't exactly afraid, more cautious. She could tell when a beast was angry or menacing, and that creature wasn't either of those. She highly suspected it had actually saved her life by bringing her here, which showed a high form of intelligence. She decided to take a slow step forward, to see how the creature would react. It didn't seem panicked in any way, and actually, came gently to her. She could see its thin nostrils moving a bit, smelling her. Cassandra suddenly realized what the shimmering on its scales was. It had been disturbing her for a while now. Salt. Was that water salty? Could it be linked to the actual sea? The creature kept moving its iridescent scales and, just like its size, Cassandra had been wrong about its color as well. It wasn't dark, but actually more of a shimmery gray. There were some other colors shimmering in the light, making her think those scales were opal-like. Just like the stones of that cave. Was this the creature's lair? An idea was beginning to grow in Cassandra's mind, and somehow, she started to really believe in it. She remembered what she had been taught when she was much, much younger. She hesitated, putting an arm out and extending her hand, though she was a bit scared and probably crazy to do so. The creature didn't try to sniff it as Cray would have. Instead, it slid its long body past it, making Cassandra touch its strange, polished scales. She chuckled, impressed. The creature began circling around her, making one, then two rings with its body, keeping Cassandra inside. It still wasn't menacing, but she felt like it was establishing some sort of protection around her. Cassandra smiled. I think I know who you are, she whispered, amazed. The creature didn't react to her words, but after taking a deep breath, the young woman started singing. She used her native tongue, careful about her voice and her words, and sang the mermaid's requiem. After listening to her for a few seconds, the creature started singing a high-pitched song too. It sounded like a wind blowing against some glass, a high-pitched but gentle sound. When she was done, the creature put its head closer to her, and after a slight hesitation, Cassandra gently caressed its head. Her heart was beating like crazy, almost certain she was right. All the legends from her childhood were taking form in this amazing creature in front of her. "You're really the water god," she whispered. She was overwhelmed with emotion, almost to the point of crying. She had never questioned its existence, but having the deity-like being right next to her was an amazing sensation. The creature sang softly again, making Cassandra chuckle, a tear escaping her eye. She took a deep breath. Though it was a beautiful moment, she didn't have much time for that. She couldn't forget the crisis that was going on outside this cave, and how her family needed her. She extended her arm to caress the scales again. "I need your help," she whispered in her native tongue. "I really need to get back to the others, to my family." She wasn't sure he would understand her, but just then, the creature looked up, at the long slit in the ceiling. Just as she thought, there was something up there. The exact moment when Cassandra looked up, she very clearly saw a shadow for a second. What was that? "Kyun!" Cassandra jumped, as the baby dragon suddenly jumped out of the water, flapping its little wings and chasing the water. "Kyun? How did you get here?" She ran to the baby dragon, who happily jumped in her arms with many little squeaks. Kyun kept rubbing its head against her chest while Cassandra looked at the pond again. This was definitely connected to the lake somehow. If so, how deep and wide was the lake under the surface, and beneath which room could it have spread? Kyuyu. Kyun seemed to have just noticed the gigantic creature, and very boldly jumped from Cassandra's arm to run to it. Without any fear, the little dragon hopped onto the first ring of the body, under the creature's eyes. Its white eyes were on Kyun with a bit of interest, watching the baby dragon's moves. Kyun jumped higher, onto the second and higher ring, and glanced at Cassandra. Was he showing off? She tried to call Kyun, but the little dragon ignored her and turned to the head of the body it had just climbed. The water god seemed interested in the baby dragon and brought its head closer, sniffing it. However, a sniff from such a big creature was like a gust of wind to Kyun, and the tiny dragon was pushed away. Just as Cassandra feared it might fall, the dragon started flapping its little wings and looked up. Now that she saw them together, there was a bit of resemblance in their body shape, though Kyun was still more like Cray. Kyun! The baby dragon started flying higher, looking suddenly attracted to that slit in the ceiling. The water god, looking curious about the baby dragon, followed its flight up, extending its body to raise it. Cassandra immediately saw her chance. With a silent apology, she climbed on the creature's body just like Kyun had done before. She was bigger than the baby dragon, but still no bigger than a kitten compared to the gigantic water creature. If it felt her climbing on its scales, it didn't show any discomfort at all. Cassandra struggled to keep going, with her aching muscles, overall exhaustion, and the climb that was becoming more and more vertical and abrupt. Whatever was above them, she silently prayed it wasn't going to be another terrible place to fall into. Just when she had finally climbed past the second ring, she realized she wouldn't be able to climb up the neck of the creature. Just then, it seemed to finally spot her, and before she could do anything, it pushed her up onto its head, leaving Cassandra hanging on by its horns. Cassandra couldn't help but let out a little scream in fear, but Kyun apparently took it for an excited cry, and made a similar high-pitched noise, all happy and flying around her. The creature kept going higher, understanding her goal, and Kian's. As they finally reached the breach, Cassandra realized it would be just large enough to let her through, but there was no way the creature could follow her. She bit her lip, and Kian jumped through the crack above her, disappearing between the two edges. She was worried for a few seconds, but then, she heard the dragon happily squeak from somewhere above. With a sigh of relief, she found a grip as soon as she could, ready to climb up. Just then, she looked at the creature, whose eyes were very close. She smiled at it. "Thank you," she whispered, and then, with a push from the creature's head, she climbed up. Despite the creature's push, Cassandra struggled to reach the upper level. She was really tired, hurting all over, and not sure about what she should expect next. She just hoped that the crack in the ceiling wasn't going to lead her into another deadly trap. She had almost died too many times today already. The only reason she was feeling a little bit better was Kian. Though she had no idea how it had found her and gotten there, the little dragon being all jumpy and fine meant Cashin ought to be safe and sound somewhere out there as well. Cassandra had no idea how long she had stayed unconscious when she was with the water god, but she felt like it had been a few hours at least. She hoped things had progressed up there, and in a good way at that. She was silently dying to see Karen again. Cassandra didn't want to get her hopes up too soon, but she hoped he was somewhere near. She had that strange conviction in her heart that the war god had returned to the capital. "Kyun! I'm coming," she sighed, trying to pull herself up and catch up with the excited baby dragon. She had no idea what to expect once she had climbed out of that breach, but anyway, she wouldn't have been able to imagine it. This looked like another cave, only much, much bigger. It was actually carved to have a roughly square shape. The walls were definitely made of the same material as the one below, though, that shining grey stone. Cassandra had no idea what it was, and she couldn't remember having seen anything similar within the palace's walls. So, where in the world were they? She felt a bit too tired to stand, and remained seated to look at her surroundings. Kian was already happily running around and sniffing everything with curious eyes. The much bigger cave continued past her line of sight, as if she had emerged at one end of it. More curiously, she noticed some strange, black spherical shapes. A lot of them were broken open, and looked as if they could crumble and fall into dust at any second. Stones? Their shape was a bit intriguing, and Kian too kept sniffing them with curious eyes. Everything there was really quiet, but Cassandra could hear some sort of faint wind coming from the other side. The light was coming from a little hole in the ceiling, too. This was definitely sunlight, and this opening was too round to be a natural one. Who would have carved a window in a cave, and why? In any case, it was too high for Kian to carry her up there, and actually, she wasn't even sure it would be wide enough for her to get through. The distance was blurred with all her surroundings looking like the same rocky walls. She finally stood up, and the baby dragon immediately ran back to her to rub its body against her leg, almost like a cat. Kian was apparently determined to stay around her, and though the dragon kept venturing everywhere to have a look, it was coming back to her every 10 seconds or so. Since the young dragon looked so fearless and enthusiastic, Cassandra walked further into the cave, intrigued. There was nothing but those countless broken spheres. She couldn't understand what they were. They were not made of the same material as the stones, they were darker, but gave off a similar feeling to the onyx castle. As she kept walking, the echo of her own steps made her slowly realize how big this new cave actually was. Unlike the one from before, this one seemed to continue for miles, like some tube just getting wider and wider. The breach she had come out of was already far behind her when she found another window above her, throwing light on more bigger, broken spheres. She suddenly realized she had been wrong. Those things weren't spheres. They were empty shells. Now that she could see some more complete ones, the shape wasn't so round and was similar to Qian's dragon egg. She hadn't noticed before because even the material looked different, and none looked alive or illuminated like Kray's egg once was. She was baffled. What were those dragon eggs doing here? There were hundreds of them. Some looked so old they were almost turning into stones. The baby dragon squealed, sniffing one of the eggs and putting its little front paws on it to look inside, but Cassandra grabbed the dragon and carried it instead. Somehow, she didn't like the idea of Qian playing with empty dragon shells. This whole place felt like some kind of cemetery. There was a really uneasy feeling growing in her heart from seeing those empty shells. From the looks of those, they must have belonged to dragons that lived years and years ago, maybe centuries. Cassandra kept walking, and as her arms got tired, Qian jumped out of them to walk ahead. However, this time the baby dragon didn't look as curious anymore. It actually had its wings close to its body, and looked more cautious than before. Was Qian feeling something she didn't? Cassandra hoped they wouldn't encounter anything too dangerous in here. She kept trying to understand the Emperor's purpose. Did he know she would find the water god in the lake and understand what the creature was? Did he even know about it? Or was he hoping she'd find that breach and get here? She hoped the old man was all right. Qian had stopped, looking a bit wary of whatever was ahead. Cassandra caught up to the baby dragon with a frown, and indeed, there was a noticeable change in their surroundings. The eggs around them were considerably bigger, and unlike the previous ones, they still had some color on them. They were getting closer to the end of the strange tunnel, she could feel it. Cassandra was starting to realize where they were standing. She had forgotten about this place, actually. Suddenly, Qian froze, before running back towards her and hiding behind her leg. Something was scaring the baby dragon? It wasn't growling, but the emerald eyes were focused on something right after the next turn. Cassandra walked towards it. The wind she had heard before was getting louder, and coming in little waves. It wasn't wind, but breathing. They were finally met with an impressive mountain of golden scales. "Glahad!" she exclaimed. What was the Emperor's dragon doing there? Recognizing the magnificent creature, Cassandra ran to it, but the gigantic dragon looked uninterested. The dragon was curled upon itself, its ruby eyes half open, looking incredibly passive. It didn't even seem to care about them, and barely reacted. Seeing that Cassandra wasn't scared, Qian came out and carefully scurried over to look. The difference in size between the two was impressive. Qian was like a big cat, while Glahad was like a little mountain by itself. The baby dragon kept looking around the giant dragon and poking at it curiously. However, the older one didn't seem to care. Cassandra realized Glahad was in some way Qian's grandfather, but the golden dragon looked completely disinterested in anything. It was so calm that Cassandra had no fear approaching it. "Claude, what is it?" she asked. Giving no answer, its ruby eyes shifted to her, without any other kind of reaction. It looked like the golden dragon was depressed. That realization carved a hole in Cassandra's heart, as a scary thought sprouted in her mind. She shook her head, choking up a little, and tried to look around. There was nothing else but empty dragon shells here. This was definitely the Emperor's dragon vault, but what was Claude doing there? Abandoning the old dragon for a few seconds, Cassandra made the detour around its body, which occupied half of the way, to check what was around the other side. She gasped. A gigantic door. It was made with the same stones as all the walls there, but the square shape and the gigantic handle on it couldn't be mistaken. Cassandra was amazed. So they really were in the dragon's vault. Didn't Sherrian say before that this place was right behind the throne room? Meaning they were just a few steps away from getting back inside the imperial palace. Cassandra hurried over, but she couldn't even understand how to open the door. The handle was way too heavy. She couldn't even move it at all. How was she supposed to pull on it? She suddenly realized this was how the imperial family members were the only ones who could get in. It took superhuman strength to get that lock open, or a dragon's help. Lady Karine was human, yet she had been in here before to retrieve Kian's egg. She couldn't have done it by herself. However, with the help of a dragon, she could have. Cassandra turned back to the Emperor's dragon. Would Claude help her? Opening that door would be a matter of seconds for a dragon, but how to convince it to help? She walked over. Kian, a bit lost by her back and forth, decided to sit down and tilt its head, observing her movements. Cassandra didn't have time to worry about what Kian was doing, she just went back to face the golden dragon's head. She knew Claude wasn't going to hurt her, as the Emperor did like her. Would the dragon help her? She wasn't sure of the situation outside, but it was very probable Claude had somehow been forced in here. This was the Emperor's dragon, though. Even if the dragon was locked in here, it was the only one strong enough to break out. Claude just needed the will to do so. "Claude, please, you have to help me get out of here," she said. This time, there was no movement. The golden dragon looked like it had absolutely no intention of doing anything. Even if it was depressed, Claude couldn't simply stay here. Cassandra walked closer, desperate. "Claude. I don't know what happened to His Highness, but..." This time, the golden dragon growled as a warning, its ruby eyes opening wide. Cassandra jumped back in surprise. She wasn't prepared for the Emperor's dragon to actually get mad at her once she'd mentioned the Emperor. Kian, upset at Claude's growling, jumped between her and its dragon ancestor and growled back. Its attempts to growl were once again no more than a kitten's meow compared to the fierce growl of a proper adult dragon. Still, it at least got Claude's attention. "But you can't abandon Karen," continued Cassandra, careful with her words. "You know he is the favorite son, the one that should take the golden throne. He and Sherrian ought to be out there. You can't let Vrihan and Lefis do this." Despite her plea, the golden dragon didn't move much. At least, Claude kept both scarlet eyes on her, looking like it was listening, but not reacting much. Cassandra was desperate. She wasn't even sure how much Glahad understood her words. Cray had always seemed able to understand her, but maybe the black dragon was just imitating its master and reacting to her words. Cassandra wasn't sure of anything anymore, but she glanced down at Kian. Cashin was in danger out there, and so was his father. Maybe convincing the golden dragon was the last chance to save them. Glahad. You know the Emperor didn't want this. The golden dragon resumed its furious growling, but despite her fear, Cassandra continued. You can't stay here and do nothing. Karen needs you, Sherian too. The Emperor has a new grandson, Cashin, my son, and you can't let him die. This time, the dragon stopped growling, apparently having heard her. Cassandra grabbed Kian off the floor, though the baby dragon was still fearlessly growling at Glahad. You have to help me get out of here, please. Vrihan will kill them. Karen, Sherian, even Prince Ophius, Prince Anur, and Lady Karine, too. Having heard about the imperial concubine, Glahad finally raised its head, making Cassandra sigh in relief. The Emperor's love for Lady Karine may save their lives, after all. Her name had definitely made the dragon react. I know. I know His Highness wanted Lady Karine to be safe. He loved her, and wherever she was, he was fine with it because she was safe, right? As long as Vrihan is out there, she won't be safe anymore, Glahad. You can't give up on the one love His Highness wanted to protect. The dragon suddenly emitted a long higher-pitched sound that sounded like a wailing to Cassandra. She was actually crying. She didn't want to admit the Emperor may be dead, but the thought was making its way in reluctantly. So many things were pushing her towards it, no matter how much she didn't want it to be true. She wasn't ready to hear it, neither was Glahad, and yet the golden dragon knew. Glahad, please. With a growl, the golden dragon finally moved. Glahad's humongous body slowly rose up, and Kian made itself very small in Cassandra's arms, obviously impressed and scared. Glahad was incredibly big, and once the dragon was standing, its body occupied more than half of the space there. Cassandra had to retreat against the wall to not risk being crushed. It seemed like Glahad knew exactly what to do. The golden dragon turned around, its ruby eyes going to the gigantic door. Cassandra couldn't imagine how Glahad had been made to stay here, but she doubted there was anything that could efficiently contain the most powerful creature in this empire. The golden dragon growled and raised a paw to grab the giant handle. Due to the size of its claws, only two of them could pull, but still, the dragon had no trouble lifting it, unlike Cassandra had earlier. She felt a wave of hope as the door started making an awful ruckus from the pressure. However, it wasn't moving so easily. After a few seconds, it became obvious Glahad had to use considerable strength to try and open it. Something was blocking it, but the golden dragon was not giving up. It started growling furiously, determined. Come on, Glahad. Please, whispered Cassandra. In her arms, Kian started cheering too with excited little growls and squeaks, its eyes riveted on the adult dragon. Glahad struggled more and more. The dragon growled furiously against that door that was not opening, and it kept pulling. Cassandra was worried to see the base of one claw starting to bleed, but Glahad wouldn't stop. The old dragon kept using all of its strength, arching its back and putting all of its body into it. Cassandra felt the tension as if she had been pulling too, and silently cheered, praying that this was going to work. Finally, the door moved. Strangely, an awful noise was heard. The sound of something massive and heavy resonated in the vault, and Cassandra had to protect her ears. Yet, Glahad growled even more furiously, pulling the handle even more. The golden dragon was determined, and the door was still resisting, but it was almost done. Cassandra could finally see the opening. Jumping at her feet, Kian chirped excitedly and ran to jump on the golden dragon's back. The little dragon climbed up the body that was at least 10 times bigger than its own, peeking at what was going on behind the door. Kian suddenly made another one of those high-pitched sounds, and in a split second, Cassandra saw the baby dragon jump and fly away into the small space. "Kian," she called, too late. Where had it gone? Cassandra didn't like losing her son's dragon, she was scared something would happen to it. She knew that door had to open up to somewhere behind the Emperor's giant golden throne. However, soon enough, she heard another furious growling, and this time, it wasn't coming from Glahad. She froze, but those growls were coming from wherever Kian had gone to, and even scarier, she could tell those weren't Krays. She was terrified to go there, but even more terrified that something would have happened to the baby dragon. Running to the other side of Glahad, she went to face the open space, but almost immediately she stepped back, terrorized by what she had seen behind it. Red scales. The thought had crossed her mind while seeing where they were headed. She had heard the horn and seen Glahad's misery. She could only think of one scenario to explain all that, but she had been pushing those dark thoughts to the back of her mind, until now. She just didn't want to think about such a horrible outcome. The growls of both dragons became louder and louder, and more terrifying. The more Glahad was pushing the door, struggling to open it, the more Vrihan's dragon was trying to prevent the golden dragon from getting out. Despite the difference in strength between the two, Glahad was somehow weaker than usual. Cassandra bit her lower lip. The Emperor's state had definitely had an effect on his dragon. She couldn't stay here though, not when she had lost sight of Kian. The gap was now wide enough for her to slip through. Actually, 2 men could have fit through, but it was still not large enough for a full-grown dragon. Cassandra tried to position herself around the golden dragon, watching both creatures' actions. This was extremely risky. Kian had quickly flown out, but she would have to make a run and pray. It would take only a second for the red dragon to notice her and kill her. Hopefully, she could escape it, and even perhaps distract it enough that Glahad could finish opening the door and be free. Cassandra was starting to become concerned about all the ruckus she could hear on the other side. Cassandra wasn't familiar with the battlefield, but the horrible sounds and screams she could hear coming from behind the wall of red scales looked very much like a war was going on out there. What was happening in the throne's room? Who was fighting whom? Her heartbeat was accelerating fast. If Kian had flown so confidently, it ought to know who was behind that door. And there weren't many people the baby dragon would fly to. Raising her green eyes on the red dragon, Cassandra took a deep breath and prepared herself to make a run for it. Glahad was still struggling and growling furiously, and hopefully, the ruckus would hide her escape even more. The red dragon probably hadn't even noticed her. She remembered she and Kian had worked together to make the beast blind, permanently perhaps. She took a deep breath, and started running. This short distance felt like miles away. Cassandra had no idea what she would find behind the door, but she couldn't stay back and wait to be caught in a fight between two adult dragons. She just ran in a straight line, her eyes riveted on the little space where she could see an actual wall behind Vrihan's dragon. Her heartbeat went even crazier when she ran past the door. Just a bit more. She kept running, even stumbled on something, a rock or a claw, and got back up to keep running again. Finally, Cassandra jumped over a red paw, and fell on all fours, next to the Emperor's throne. Her eyes tried to grasp a hold of the situation as quickly as possible. Dozens of men were fighting in the hall, but many of them were down on the ground already. The whole room had its floor covered in blood. It truly was a battlefield, all contained in one room. She looked up, trying to find who the assailants were when she finally saw him. Karen. She lost her breath for a second. He was standing there, a few meters away from her. As if he had felt her stare on him, his black eyes rose up to look for her, too. For a couple of precious seconds, they found each other. She was shocked, her heart couldn't even contain this much emotion at once. Tears appeared in her eyes. He really was there. Her war god, her prince. Karen was there, standing proudly, his body covered in scales and blood, but alive. She smiled, almost nervously, in such relief her mind couldn't formulate a thought strong enough. Karen, Karen, Karen. She could barely believe it, but it was his obsidian eyes riveted on her. Kai. She tried to call him when a wave of pain tore her scalp. Cassandra felt herself being pulled back, as a large hand was holding on by her hair. She suddenly felt the cold metal of a blade held on her throat, and she gasped in horror. She had almost forgotten every dragon ought to have its master close by. She tried to fight herself, but a sharp pain on her neck prevented her from trying any further. Look, look, Karen. Your precious little witch came right into my arms. Cassandra's heart went from relief to horror in a split second. After she had tried so hard to fight him, she had ended up in Vrihan's hands. She wanted to scream in despair. She couldn't believe it, all of this for nothing. She could hear the two dragons still struggling behind her. Klahad was still fighting to get out, but this seemed like a minor detail compared to the fight between the brothers. Karen's face had gone white as soon as Vrihan touched Cassandra. She heard the second prince laugh horribly, catching the attention of not only Karen but his sister, too. Sherian let go of the dead body she was holding and glared at Vrihan. You rat face! Oh, be careful, Sherian. I already killed one of them, I'll happily make it last longer for the other one. Cassandra's blood went cold. Killed who? Who had he killed? She felt like she was missing an important piece of information, and her eyes searched around the room. Then she saw it. She hadn't even seen it when she was so close. Miss Andra, laying in a pool of blood right at their feet. Cassandra immediately screamed in horror. No, no, not her younger sister, not Miss Andra. Not me. She couldn't even stand that horrible vision. Her sister was lying, not moving, her body circled and covered in red. She couldn't even see her face, as she was lying on her stomach, her face in the blood and covered by her hair. Cassandra couldn't stop crying. She couldn't even check if Miss Andra was really dead. She couldn't stand it, she kept shaking her head and struggling against Vrihan. Enough! On her right, another figure appeared. Cassandra glared as she had never glared at anyone before. Lephis, with his neck perfectly fine. The fifth brother chuckled, amused by her glare, and walked over. He pushed Miss Andra with his feet, looking bored. In horror, Cassandra saw her younger sister's body roll down the stairs. She gasped and cried, fighting Vrihan to try and go see her. Across the room, Sherian was just as horrified. Lephis, you son of a asterisk! Shut up, Sherian, protested the fifth brother. You are not in charge anymore, and if you don't want him dead yet, shut up, for once. The princess glared at him, but for once, she truly had no choice. Vrihan was holding Cassandra, a blade clearly held against her throat, and they knew he wouldn't have the slightest remorse over killing her. Karen was facing his worst nightmare. He was too far to do anything without risking Cassandra being killed. From far away, they heard the furious growls of Cray adding to those of the two dragons already present. Kian, who had flown to Karen earlier, looked worried too. The baby dragon began retreating behind Karen's legs, but still growling a bit. This situation was a nightmare. Cassandra knew Karen would kill his brother if she wasn't there. It may even explain why her sister had been like this already. She gasped, and struggled again, furious. You won't be emperor, she hissed, her eyes full of tears and her voice hoarse. Oh, I already am. The council agreed to make me the emperor just an hour ago. You are no emperor, she protested. And you won't become one. You'll be dead. This empire doesn't need an emperor like you, no one would allow that. Not the council, not the former emperor, not your siblings, no one. The gods themselves will punish you. You have no rights but those of a cheater, a coward. Shut up, yelled Vrihan. Out of anger, he raised his blade, and cut a long line down Cassandra's back, making the young woman scream in pain. She had tears in her eyes, but compared to everything she had experienced before, this was nothing. She couldn't allow this. She had come here to make sure Vrihan wouldn't be the emperor. She knew this would mean her son's death, Karen's death, and if she was the obstacle to ensure their safety, Cassandra didn't care. I am the strongest emperor. Karen is nothing. You're about to die, hissed Sherian. You can't be emperor when your dragon is weak, added Cassandra. Everyone will know the emperor had the weakest dragon out of his brothers. You can't fight Cray, and you can't fight Karen. You even locked up the emperor's dragon because you couldn't see that. Behind them, a horrible ruckus suddenly rose as Glahad broke free from the vault. The door exploded behind them, and everyone near the throne lost their ground. Cassandra pushed Vrihan, and instead of trying a run she could never make, she jumped to get down the stairs. Her body violently hit the stairs, one after another, but finally, she found herself above Miss Sandra's body, just in time to protect her. The exploded door sent rocks raining down on them, and she tried to protect her head. She felt vivid pains assaulting her body, but she tried to withstand it. It only lasted a few seconds, after which she found herself covered in dust, and more importantly, caught between the fight of two dragons. Klahad, finally free, attacked the red dragon furiously, despite the little space. She turned her head around, trying to spot Karen in this mess. The first one she saw was Lephis, screaming something she couldn't understand. His eyes were riveted on the two dragons fighting. Cassandra knew she had to make use of every second she had. She touched Miss Andra, and much to her relief, her sister seemed alive. Barely. The younger sister was still breathing weakly. Cassandra tried to stand up next, but a sharp pain kept her still. She turned her eyes and realized her left leg was stuck under a large piece of rock. She couldn't even move it. How come she hadn't felt the pain earlier? She tried to stop her tears and looked around for help through the cloud of dust. "Karen," she yelled. "Sharian," she called, again and again, even coughing when she breathed in too much dust. Cassandra was absolutely desperate. With the stones of the door exploding in all directions, and the dragons fighting, this room had gone from a war zone to complete chaos. She saw Imperial guards running in all directions, and she couldn't spot Sharian or Karen. She couldn't move Miss Andra, but she searched her sister, checking all of her injuries and pockets. Cassandra reacted as soon as she heard the voice coming from behind her. Had he not yelled, he may have avoided this, but the young woman lifted her sister's dagger at the last second, to protect herself. Vrihan screamed, covering his face and the blood that was flowing. Cassandra was satisfied she had injured him, but she was still stuck there, in front of the murderer. Cassandra couldn't see the extent of the injury she had just caused. All she could see was Vrihan, staggering back while holding his face and screaming. His hands were literally covered in blood. Sharpened by Karen, Fitra's dagger had become a murderous weapon used against her own brother. Cassandra didn't have much time to contemplate what she had done, though. She kept trying to push the rock from her leg, desperate to move and get out of there. Her throat was painful, she kept coughing and crying, as the dust was making the scene an absolute nightmare. She could hear the furious growls of dragons battling somewhere above her. With Klahad free, the two dragons had just taken the fight into the throne room, causing more damage every time they threw each other against the walls. Even the roof was starting to creak dangerously above their heads. Cassandra had briefly seen it had been sealed when she had walked in, but how much longer would that hold? Was that Vrihan's precaution against another dragon's attack? Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.